All right, so today we're diving into this period before the American Revolution.
Yeah.
You know, people always think about like the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence and all that stuff, but
Right.
what about those couple of decades before?
Hmm.
The 1750s, the 1760s.
Yeah, what was going on?
What was going on? What was brewing?
Right.
What were the dynamics
Like
between
starting-
England and
Revolution.
the colonies? That's what we're going to look at today.
Absolutely.
And we have this great source, Chapter 4,
Yeah.
The Empire in Transition, which is from a
Yes.
pretty standard American history textbook.
Yeah.
But this chapter in particular I found super fascinating.
Me too.
And we're gonna dive into it.
To it.
But before we get into the specifics of it, I think one of the most interesting things is how they frame it. And it's like you had these 13 colonies, but they weren't like, this unified force that was just like, we're going to rebel against England.
Right.
Like they were all kind of doing their own thing.
They had their own interests.
Yeah, and their relationships with the British Crown were
Their own distinct.
very different
Okay,
relationships.
yeah.
Yeah, so I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating about this period is that it really does show how like a hands-off approach by a powerful empire like Britain can really backfire.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And it unintentionally laid the groundwork for this revolution they tried to prevent.
Right, so this is salutary neglect that we're talking about.
Exactly. Salutary neglect.
And it's such a weird term.
It is.
Like it almost sounds positive.
Right.
Yeah, salutary.
It's healthy neglect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But basically, it's just like England being like, you know what? We're busy. We got stuff going on over here.
Right. You do you.
We're going to let you colonies just do your own thing.
Yeah, kind of.
And that worked for a while, right?
For a while, yeah. I mean, it did allow the colonies to kind of develop their own economies. They started to govern themselves.
Yeah.
And, it fostered this sense of self-reliance.
Totally.
And autonomy.
But as anybody who's ever, had a teenager or been a teenager can tell you, if you give somebody that much freedom,
right,
they're probably going to
you're going to have problems.
Start doing some things you don't want them to do.
Exactly.
So
and that's
kind of what happened.
Ended up happening
with the colonies.
Right.
So, okay, before we get too deep into that.
Yeah.
You said that, England was busy doing other things.
Yes.
What else was going on? I mean, what other players were involved here?
Well, I mean, it wasn't just, Britain and the colonies. You also had the French.
Right.
Who controlled a vast territory in the interior of North America.
Right.
And then you had this very powerful group.
The Iroquois.
The Iroquois Confederacy.
Yeah.
Incredibly powerful, and they were masters at playing both sides.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have this three-way
power struggle
going on.
Yeah.
And that's where the French and Indian War comes in.
That leads us right into that conflict.
Which is so crazy because it's called the French and Indian War.
Yeah.
But it's like part of this much larger global conflict, the 7 Years' War.
Exactly. It's like what's going on.
In this war, the French and Indian War, I mean, it
just changes everything.
It's a turning point for a lot of reasons.
In so many ways, yeah.
But one of the big ones is that it really kind of forced the colonists to deal with this harsh reality of British military rule.
Right.
I mean, British commanders would often impress colonists into military service.
Oh, wow.
So basically force them to fight.
You're just taken.
Yeah, they would seize their supplies without any compensation.
Jeez. Can you imagine? Like, a war comes to your town, and they're just like, all right, we're taking your stuff, and you're coming with us.
Right. I mean, you can imagine how that would breed resentment.
Totally.
Yeah, and a desire for more autonomy.
Yeah, for sure. And then, of course, there's the impact on Native American tribes, too.
Right.
I mean, this war further displaced many of them.
Yeah.
It weakened their power.
For sure.
And it really set the stage for future conflicts over land and resources.
Yeah. It's just a reminder that, this isn't just a story about the British and the colonists like the Native Americans are.
There's a central part of this story.
Absolutely.
They're often caught in the middle of these conflicts.
Okay, so back to the war.
Okay.
So the British win.
They do, yeah.
But it's like a very costly.
Very costly. They're in debt.
Massive war debt, yeah.
And so
they got to figure out how to pay for it.
That's where they kind of turn to the colonies and they're like, all right, no more salutary neglect.
Right. That comes to an end.
We need to start making some money off of you guys.
Yeah. We need to exert more control.
Right. So they won the war, but in a way, they kind of lost the peace. because now they're setting up this whole other conflict. Exactly, yeah. They shift from this neglect to this much more kind of forceful control.
Right. And it was a huge turning point in their relationship with the colonies.
Absolutely.
And how did this actually play out? Like, how did they start asserting this control?
Well, it all started with a series of acts, actually.
Acts meaning like laws.
Yeah, laws, exactly.
Right.
And they ultimately backfired.
Yeah.
But the first one is the Currency Act of 1764.
Okay, Currency Act. So this is about money.
It is.
So what did they do?
While they basically banned the colonies from printing their own paper money.
What?
Yeah, they said, nope, you can't do that anymore.
So they had to use British currency.
They had to rely on British currency, which was scarce.
Wow. So that's like immediately putting a squeeze on the colonial economy.
Absolutely. It limited their ability to trade, manage their own finances.
Wow. Okay, so that's the Currency Act.
That's the Currency Act, yeah.
What else?
So then in the same year, you have the Sugar Act,
Sugar Act of 1764.
1764.
Okay, so what was that about?
Well, this one raised taxes on molasses.
Molasses, okay.
And it really tightened customs enforcement.
So they were trying to like
Crack down on smuggling.
prevent smuggling, make sure they were getting their cut.
Exactly.
Okay, but the colonists obviously weren't too happy about this.
No, they saw this as an infringement.
That's like more control,
More control, yeah.
less freedom.
Yeah.
And I was reading that like people like John Hancock
Oh, yeah.
were like finding ways to get around these taxes.
Right.
Like smuggling molasses, bribing officials.
They were clever.
Like they were not having it.
No.
So that's the Sugar Act,
The big one, the Stamp Act,
1765.
1765.
This is like the one that everybody learns about in school.
Right, the infamous Stamp Act.
Yeah, so remind us, like, what was the Stamp Act? What did it actually do?
Well, it required colonists to purchase stamps for all sorts of printed material.
Like everything?
Yeah, legal documents, newspapers,
Wow.
even playing cards.
Oh my gosh, playing cards.
Yeah.
So like every piece of paper you used, you had to pay a tax on.
Essentially, yes.
And this was like the first direct tax that was imposed on the colonies by Parliament.
Right, directly by Parliament.
Yeah, so the colonists were like,
They were outraged.
no taxation without representation.
That's the cry.
That's when that all starts.
That's the rallying cry, yeah.
Right, and the Stamp Act is really a turning point because it like really galvanized colonial resistance.
Absolutely.
And it led to all sorts of like, protests.
Protests, demonstrations.
Organization.
Groups like the Sons of Liberty popped up.
Oh, yeah.
Who used all kinds of, public demonstrations, sometimes even violence.
To get their point across.
Yeah, to intimidate those British officials.
Okay, so we're starting to see things really heat up.
Yeah, things are escalating.
But before we like get too deep into those, protests and everything, there's another event that we need to talk about.
Yeah.
And that is the Proclamation of 1763.
Yes, so this proclamation was issued after the French and Indian War.
Right.
And it basically prohibited colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains.
West of the Appalachians.
Yeah.
So like they couldn't go into like the Ohio
yeah.
Valley and all that.
Right, they couldn't expand westward.
So why would they do that?
Well, the British government, they were trying to prevent further conflict with Native American tribes.
Right.
They wanted to maintain some kind of control over this westward expansion.
Makes sense, like on paper.
Right.
But if you're a colonist.
If you're a colonist.
And you just like risked your life fighting in this war.
Yeah, you fought for this land.
Won the war, helped secure this land.
Right.
And now you're told you can't even settle there.
You can't go there.
That's got to be
It's a slap in the face.
infuriating.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it was. They saw this as a betrayal.
Wow.
Yeah, and it fueled their resentment toward British rule even more.
Yeah, and it just highlights how complicated this relationship was.
So complicated.
Between
Yeah, I mean,
the British, the colonists, the Native Americans.
it's this three-way tug of war.
Yeah, and who knows who's going to win.
Nobody knows who's going to win at this point.
And this tension wasn't just like, between these big empires and colonies.
Right.
It was like bubbling up within colonial society itself.
Exactly.
And I think the story of the Paxton Boys really highlights this.
Yeah, they're a great example of this internal conflict.
Okay, so who were the Paxton Boys?
Well, they were these frontier vigilantes in Pennsylvania.
Vigilantes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mostly Scots-Irish settlers.
Okay.
And they were dealing with constant threats from Native American raids.
Right, like they're on the frontier.
Right on the frontier.
So they're the ones who are facing the brunt of this conflict.
Exactly.
So what did they do?
Well, Instead of seeking help from the colonial government,
Right.
they decided to take matters into their own hands.
Which is never good.
Never a good idea.
Never a good idea, vigilante justice.
Yeah, and in 1763, they massacred 20 peaceful Conestoga Indians.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And that was just out of like
Fear, anger,
anger.
prejudice.
Yeah. And this really shocked the colony.
Yeah, it was a horrific event.
Yeah. And it really highlights like the deep divisions within colonial society itself.
Absolutely. And I think it also reveals the limits of British authority at this time.
Right.
And the growing sense of lawlessness in the backcountry.
Because the colonial government couldn't protect them or wouldn't protect them.
Yeah, or wouldn't, or both.
Yeah.
So that further eroded trust
Yeah.
in the system.
So you have all these things coming together.
Right.
You have resentment toward British policies.
Yes.
Internal divisions within the colonies.
Yeah.
Conflicts with Native Americans.
It's a powder keg.
Yeah. And it's all kind of like ready to explode.
Yeah, waiting for a spark.
And we'll see how that powder keg ignites in the next part of our deep dive.
Exactly.
We left off with the colonies practically ready to fight, militias popping up everywhere, and tensions so thick you could cut it with a knife.
Right. And in this supercharged atmosphere, a few key things happened that pushed them over the edge. One of them was the Boston Massacre in 1770.
Oh, man, the Boston Massacre. Can you imagine that? You're in Boston. British soldiers are everywhere enforcing these laws nobody likes. Everybody's nervous. And then, bam, this confrontation breaks out between some colonists and a British soldier right outside the customs house.
Right. We still argue about what really went down that night.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But things escalated really quickly. More soldiers showed up. Shots were fired. 5 colonists were killed.
5 colonists dead. Wow.
Yeah, and the Boston Massacre, that's what they called it. It was a huge shock to the colonies.
Of course, like a symbol of how oppressive Britain was.
Exactly. It showed everyone how dangerous things were getting.
Right. Like if they can shoot us in the streets, what else are they capable of?
And guys like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, they made sure everyone knew about it.
Oh, yeah, they used it to fire people up, get them even more against the British.
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of how one event, even a messy one like this, can change the course of history.
Right, and this was just the beginning. 3 years later, they pulled off that crazy stunt, the Boston Tea Party.
Oh, yeah, that was a legendary one. December 1773, a bunch of colonists dressed up like Native Americans boarded those British ships in Boston Harbor and just chucked all that tea into the water.
342 chests of tea, just gone.
Yeah, they were sending a message.
Oh, yeah, a very expensive message.
Right. It was a direct response to the Tea Act, which was supposed to make tea cheaper for the colonists.
Right.
But it was really just a way for Britain to give the East India Company a monopoly.
Control everything.
Exactly.
Smart move by the colonists, you know. They made their point, but didn't hurt anyone.
Yeah, very symbolic.
And it worked. The British were furious.
Oh, yeah, they came down hard with those coercive acts, trying to punish Massachusetts and show them who was boss.
Like closing Boston Harbor, limiting town meetings, even saying British officials accused of crimes had to be tried in England.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Right. The colonists called them the intolerable acts. And it's like Britain was practically begging them to rebel at this point.
It's crazy how they just kept pushing and pushing, making things worse.
Yeah. And we all know what happened next. April 1775, shots fired at Lexington and Concord.
The shot heard round the world.
That's when it all began, the American Revolution. They took on the most powerful empire in the world and fought for their freedom.
And they created a new nation based on those ideas of liberty, equality, self-government.
It's amazing to think about everything that led to that moment. You know, all the stuff we talked about, the salutary neglect, the anger over taxes and control, those key events that just push them further and further.
Yeah, it really shows you how history is rarely simple. You have all these different people with their own motivations and ideas clashing and colliding.
And it wasn't just about winning independence. It was about those big ideas, you know, freedom, representation, deciding their own destiny.
Absolutely. Ideas that still matter today.
So yeah, when you think about the American Revolution, don't just think about battles and dates. Think about those people who lived through it, the choices they made, and how their actions shaped the world we live in now.
Yeah, it's a story that still resonates today.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. I hope we've given you a better understanding of what went down in those years leading up to the revolution and how those events are still relevant today.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.